テレビ東京ロンドン支局のトム・シーザーです。From inside the Financial Times headquarters in the heart of the city of London, this is Inside FT, brought to you by TV Tokyo. Here's today's headline. UK demands China explain redacted parts of London embassy plan. In London's historic heart, China plans to build what could become the largest embassy in Europe, a sprawling 20,000 square meter complex at Royal Mint Court, just opposite the Tower of London. But the UK government has pushed back, demanding that Beijing reveal previously redacted architectural plans. With concerns from MPs, national security officials, and even the White House, the fate of this £225 million mega embassy may be decided soon. To unpack what this diplomatic showdown means, we spoke with Financial Times correspondent David Sheppard.
Well, the Chinese embassy it's an existing building that's been there for many decades, and in some parts of it, in fact, centuries. It sits directly opposite the famous Tower of London. So it's right close to the centre of the heart of London. And it sits over a large 5-acre site that they first bought back in 2018. Now, the view has always been they initially put in for planning permission to change this into an embassy proper, and partly to consolidate the 5 to 7 buildings that China already has as diplomatic headquarters in the UK. But this one is very, very large indeed. It would be the largest embassy in Europe should it open, but they're at the stage now of waiting and trying to get planning permission to go ahead and actually construct the site. They applied for planning permission back in early last decade and were turned down, but resubmitted the planning application shortly after the Labour government under Sir Keir Starmer came back into power last summer. The areas of the embassy which have been blacked out on the plans, the government has effectively called in the planning documents to have a look for themselves. They're taking it out of the hands of the local council that would normally decide on planning approvals for most buildings in the UK. When there's a building that's seen of strategic interest or potential national security, it can be called in by the government for them to take control. And they've looked through the plans, and there are certain areas that they have additional questions regarding, one of which is these so-called redacted or blacked out areas, which are buildings within the court, within the structure of the building, that have been effectively not detailed on the plans. Now, there are concerns about that. China would argue that this is simply a matter of national security. It's normal for embassies, which are effectively diplomatic or national territory in a different sovereign country, to have certain areas which they don't share. But there are, understandably, additional concerns at this time, given there are heightened tensions between China and the UK. Well, one of the concerns among critics of China is that the sheer size of the embassy suggests that there could be within that a large number of spies. Now, China would reject that, I'm sure, as would many countries when it comes to talking about their embassy. But everyone knows that within diplomatic circles, embassies generally are the sort of the home base for spies within that country. So it follows, I think, just from a natural conclusion, if this is a very large 5-acre site, the largest embassy in Europe, that there's an expectation that there could be increasing numbers of Chinese spies within it. And the UK has argued that China has, certainly spied on it and has taken efforts at times, they've said, to tamper with UK democracy and other concerns around industry. But at the same time, the UK is trying to have constructive relationships with China, given its rise to be a very powerful country, and they wish to trade with it. The UK is very open to sort of inward investment, but they're trying to balance that against their national security risks. At the same time, there are other more practical concerns, more technical concerns. Because this site sits right on the edge of the City of London. Now, the City of London doesn't just mean London as a whole. The city is the specific financial district area. And it's understood or believed that there are large numbers of superfast, high data volume network cables which are connected to many of the banks in that area, including banks from the United States. So there are concerns that if these cables are underneath, there's a broad concern in the security services around hybrid warfare, not just from China, but from Russia, Iran, and other countries. And one of those concerns always centers on cables and data. Now, if the theory goes, I'm not saying this would happen or that China would do this, but the concern is that if they have these cables running underneath their building, it gives them greater opportunity to potentially access them, to tap into them, and to have greater access to data from one of the world's most important financial capitals. Well, officially China has not responded in terms of how they will respond to the UK government's demands at this point. They have 2 weeks from the time of the story, which means at some point next week they need to have submitted either revised plans or provided a suitable explanation for why these areas cannot be seen. But there are additional demands from the UK government as well, one of which is that the building should have a perimeter around it. At the moment, there is not a perimeter, partly because this old building actually has an ancient UK monument, an old church, where there are ruins that can be viewed currently by the general public. And there are question marks over whether it's possible to retain that part of the building as open to the public, given it will sit within the walls, or the lack of walls as it is right now, of the Chinese embassy. China has proposed a number of things, including potentially allowing people to continue to visit these ancient sites with an allowance for UK police to oversee this. But there are certainly concerns within the UK as to how practically that might work, because you're dealing with territory which under the Vienna Convention is effectively Chinese territory in London. So if there was a large accident or some other catastrophe that affected citizens that were going in to see these sites, would there be access for emergency services, these kinds of things? That's partly why they're looking at potentially also putting a perimeter on this, because what, for example, might happen if someone walking home late at night, and now this is London of course, what if they'd had a few beers? What if they wander into the wrong place or have an accident there? There's a question mark at that point over, what happens if someone inadvertently wanders into what is effectively Chinese territory. Certainly walking a difficult and arguably very narrow path between trying to have this relationship with China based on trade and mutual respect and investment, both from the UK into China, but particularly China coming and investing into the UK, whilst not upsetting the administration of US President Donald Trump, who's clearly taken quite a hard line with China, and the sense from their administration is that they see China as their greatest adversary and the greatest challenge that the United States will face in the coming years. So for the UK, there's this difficulty because we've tried to position ourselves as a trading hub almost, somewhere that can sit between North America, the UK sits here, then we have the EU, then we have Asia. And London has always worked well in that regard as somewhere that almost sits at the centre of the map, at the centre of the time zones, and therefore helps facilitate trade between all sides. But there is this worry around China's long-term ambitions, and the US is certainly putting pressure on the UK in many regards. We saw that in the recent trade deal that Keir Starmer struck with the United States, where the US wanted to have some oversight, or at least some influence on some of the investment from China into the UK, to make sure that, I guess, that the UK was not used as a backdoor against America or in any other way. It's very much up in the air right now. A couple of weeks ago, most people, including critics of the embassy, had become close to convinced that it was going to get the green light from the UK government, that it was going to go ahead. What this objection, this demand from the UK around the blacked out areas and the questions over the planning process with China has really raised the possibility, though, that this might not happen. Of course, there is some suggestion that this is the UK appearing tough on the surface, but behind the scenes may have already agreed that, look, this will go ahead. The UK would say publicly that this is a legal process, that this is something that we have to follow as if it was any other building, that we will go through the correct legal steps depending on the review of the site and other information that goes to the ministers. They will make a proper decision on this. But as ever in politics, there is a lot happening in the background. There's a lot of undercurrents to this as well. And ultimately, what we're waiting to see is whether this is a moment whereby the UK has said, no, this is too high a risk, or we cannot risk offending our US allies, who ultimately we say we have the closest relationship with. We'd like to speak of our special relationship with the US, or whether they decide that, no, this is, look, countries have embassies all over the world, even countries that you're not always on the friendliest terms with. It's generally a bad sign not to be able to at least allow some diplomatic presence in your capital cities. And that's not something that the UK wishes to do. So it will be a very difficult situation to manage regardless of the outcome at this point.
Following this interview, the British government has delayed its verdict on the proposed Chinese embassy until October 21st. According to the latest reporting from the FT, China refused to fully disclose the plans, claiming the request was not appropriate. By pushing the decision back, what began as a simple planning application has morphed into a broader test of trust, transparency, and security, all while the fate of the Chinese mega embassy hangs in the balance. I'm Tom Caesar. Thank you for watching Inside FT.